Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a world of cold stone halls, muddy boots, and a whole lot of inherited titles you'll never remember. You're surrounded by smoky hearth fires, clinking chainmail, and suspicious stews that have probably been reheated since Tuesday. Welcome to medieval Europe where life is harsh, the politics are weirder than reality TV, and everything smells vaguely like wet wool. Now, just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Between the famine, the taxes, and the odd chance of being trampled by your lord's horse, the odds aren't exactly in your favor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the damp earth, surrounding a manor house, the main structure in a sea of thatched peasant huts. The feudal system, at least on paper, is supposed to work like a cosmic vending machine. Loyalty in, protection out. Lords offer land to vassals, vassals swear fealty, and peasants do all the work. But by the late Middle Ages, the gears in this system are grinding with sand. It's not just the weather that's breaking things down. The local lord's been spending more time throwing feasts, and fewer hours managing his estates. His vassals, they're starting to get ideas. Like, maybe they don't need to bow and scrape quite so much. Maybe they could run things themselves. Maybe, just maybe, they could keep some of that rent. Feudalism always relied on a delicate balance of obligation and fear. But across Europe, cracks are forming. Some lords are away fighting each other. Others are going broke, trying to impress the king, and some are just plain useless. You watch as a messenger gallops past another dispute. Probably another minor noble demanding land he thinks his great-granduncle once touched. Meanwhile, the peasants are noticing. The manor fields aren't being tilled as efficiently. Harvest quotas are down. And that whole God placed you here explanation is starting to wear thin. When the local priest shows up with fancier boots than anyone else in the village, here's a fun twist. Historians still argue whether feudalism was ever as structured and clear-cut as we think. In reality, it might have been more like a giant group project, with everyone faking their parts until someone got caught. The further you get from the king's castle, the fuzzier the rules become. You overhear a steward whispering to the reeve about shifting land boundaries. That common pasture over there, it might suddenly be part of Lord Renard's estate now. Not because anyone agreed to it, just because Renard has a better sword and a cousin in court. As legal customs grow messier, so does loyalty. In a world without centralized maps or Google Docs, promises blur. You might owe allegiance to your immediate lord, sure, but what if a richer one offers more grain, or promises not to tax your goats? Loyalties shift like fog over the moor. And let's not ignore the awkward fact that noble families keep dying out thanks to battle, disease, or just a bad soup decision. Their lands get divided, claimed, stolen, and fought over. A peasant like you might wake up one morning to find you've technically become part of a different fief. Surprise! Here's the quirky part. In some regions, peasants start quietly negotiating. They trade rents for fixed cash payments, slipping into what historians call commutation. Less food for the lord, more freedom for you. The manorial system, once based on mutual obligation, begins mutating into something more. Transactation. Imagine being a lord, and suddenly realizing your serfs are unionizing. Except instead of signs, they're just leaving, heading to towns, renting land elsewhere, claiming freedom because someone forgot to renew their bondage papers. Yep, that actually happened. Records were often sloppy, and peasants took full advantage. It's not all rebellion, though. Some nobles genuinely tried to keep the peaceholding court, adjusting rents, hosting communal feasts. But more often than not, they're just trying to keep up appearances. The medieval world loves ceremony, even when the scaffolding is collapsing by now. You've reached the village alehouse. A group of farmers are grumbling over mugs of weak beer. They're tired, they're taxed, and they're wondering why the manorial plow teams are running late again. One man jokes that maybe Lord Renard's oxen have gone on strike, and in a way, they have. The early signs of medieval collapse aren't thunderous, they're creaky and whispered. Overdue rents, confused boundaries, vassals hesitating before kneeling. You sense something is shifting, but no one dares say it out loud. Yet, you step outside, into the cold night air. The stars blink silently over the manor house, still solid and looming. But you can feel the hollowness behind its walls. Feudalism hasn't fallen, not yet. But its foundation is already riddled with termites. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the peaceful kind. This is the silence that comes after too many doors stay shut, and too many chimneys go cold. The roads are emptier. The carts are slower. Even the birds seem hesitant. You walk through a village that should be buzzing with life, but instead, it feels like everyone forgot to wake up this morning. But they didn't forget. They're gone. The plague has arrived. You don't know its name yet. No one does. Maybe it's punishment from heaven, or a curse brought on the wind. What you do know is that people are dying. Fast, it begins quietly. A fever here, a strange swelling there. One man collapses in the fields. By evening, his wife is coughing blood. By morning, so is the priest. Within a week, the town well is suspiciously quiet. The Black Death, though it won't be called that. For another few centuries arrives in Europe in 1347, hitching a ride on merchant ships from the east. Historians still argue whether the worst strain was bubonic, pneumonic, or a gruesome combo platter. But one thing's certain. It spreads like wildfire through dry hay, and no one is safe. You pass through another village. No one answers your greeting. A dog gnaws at a shoe in the middle of the road. The air smells like wood smoke, and something else, something sickly sweet. Like fruit left too long in the sun. Here's the mainstream history part. The plague likely killed 30 to 50% of Europe's population in just a few years. That's not a typo. Imagine half your town gone. Then imagine trying to explain why crops didn't get harvested, or why the graveyard filled up by spring. And while we're on strange facts, some people stuffed herbs up their noses, wore long, bird-beaked masks, or carried packets of dried flowers, poseurs hoping to keep the smell and the disease away. Ring-a-ring, oh roses. Anyone. Sleep tight. You stop near a shuttered apothecary. The once proud shopkeeper who used to charge outrageous fees for potions is now rumored to be buried behind his shop, wrapped in nothing but a bedsheet. The fear is that strong, but there's something odd brewing underneath the horror. A strange inversion of power, you see. With so many dead, labor suddenly becomes re-rand valuable. Peasants and workers begin to realize that the nobles need them. Fields don't plow themselves. Mills don't grind without hands. One man coughing, but still upright mutters to you that he's headed to the next town. They're offering double the wages for shepherds. You just have to survive long enough to get paid, he jokes. Then coughs again. Lords panic. The economic balance of the medieval world depends on cheap, controllable labor. But suddenly, a living worker is a hot commodity. Laws are passed to freeze wages and forbid workers from relocating. England's Statute of Laborers in 1351 tries exactly that. But good luck enforcing it when the guy holding the spear is also coughing into his elbow. And the church, it doesn't come out unscathed. Monasteries are hit hard. Priests vanish. The spiritual safety net begins to fray. If this is divine punishment, people wonder, why are the holy dying too? That's where the weird gets weirder. Flagellant movements appear groups of people who whip themselves in public to atone for everyone's sins. They march barefoot through towns, chanting and bleeding. Others take a more blame than neighbor approach. Accusations fly, often tragically targeting Jews, foreigners, or the simply unlucky. Scholars still debate whether this period created a permanent psychological scar across Europe. Did it make people more fatalistic, more cynical? Did it plant the early seeds of rebellion? Or were they already in the dirt, just waiting for a plague-sized shovel? Either way, the rhythm of medieval life changes. Traditions pause. Marriages are rushed. Inheritance laws are rewritten. Cemeteries expand overnight. You pass through a plague pit, just a field now, overgrown and still. Once, it held hundreds. There are no markers, no names. Just quiet grass and the occasional hum of wind through the trees. Yet, something is rising from all this. A slow, strange empowerment. Survivors begin to ask questions. Why follow a feudal lord who didn't protect you? Why attend a church that offered prayers, not cures? Why not move, change, adapt? And then there's the land. With so many dead, abandoned fields await new owners. Forests creep in. Wildflowers claim old paths. You step carefully, but there's no denying. The world has shifted. A noble rides past you, his armor polished but pointless. There's no enemy in sight, just silence and a labor shortage. He mutters about hiring mercenaries to guard his manor. His serfs fled weeks ago. This isn't the collapse of a building. It's the unraveling of a whole worldview. You look back one last time at the empty village. The overgrown trail. The hollow bell tower. The medieval world hasn't ended, not yet. But it's been bruised in a way it won't recover from. And all because of a flea. You wake to shouting, not battle cries, not the sounds of lords barking orders, but something rougher, angrier. It's the sound of pitchforks clanging against iron gates. The peasants are done whispering. They're yelling now, all across Europe. The ones at the bottom of the pyramid are rising up. You hear it in the village square. The murmurs of discontent have turned into chants. No more taxes. No more death dues. No more pretending we're lucky to have mud huts. You rub your eyes and take in the scene. It's not an army. It's your neighbors. The baker with soot-stained sleeves. The widow with a shovel. Even the shepherd who always smelled vaguely of turnips is here, waving a crude spear made from a broom handle. The Black Death didn't just thin the population, it loosened the grip of fear. When half the village disappears overnight, the old rules stop feeling sacred. The Lord's word suddenly carries less weight than the loudest voice at the tavern. Welcome to the age of peasant revolts. The big one happens in England. 1381. You've probably heard the name Wat Tyler, the rebellious everyman who led thousands to London demanding justice. Historians still argue whether he was a skilled leader or just caught in the momentum of a very angry crowd. Either way, he becomes a symbol. The grievances are many. A poll tax that squeezes the poor. Wages frozen despite labor shortages. Officials who abuse power and then vanish behind stone walls. And, of course, the endless bone-deep exhaustion of always being the one who tills the soil and buries the dead. While some guy named Sir Something drinks imported wine and claims divine right. But here's the kicker. These revolts aren't isolated. In France, there's the Jacquerie, in 1358, where peasants rise up against nobles who fail to protect them from invading armies. In Flanders, similar unrest brews. Even the Holy Roman Empire can't keep a lid on its. Some cities end up declaring themselves free. You pass a scribbled pamphlet nailed to a tree, an early prototype of protest literature. It doesn't use elegant Latin, just scratched ink and furious declarations. We work, we die, they feast. Crude, sure, but effective. And the church? Not much help. Some clergy side with the rebels, preaching about justice and the common man. Others call for divine punishment and tell lords to crush the mobs before Sunday Mass. It's a coin toss. Really. One quirky little tidbit from this era. During the 1381 uprising, rebels broke into the Tower of London, yes, the Tower, and found the king's officials hiding like rats. They dragged out the archbishop and the treasurer, and, well, let's just say they didn't live to explain themselves. You walk with the crowd as they surge toward the manor. No armor, no siege weapons, just numbers and fury. Inside, the steward peeks through the shutters. He knows that if this wave crashes through, no amount of titles will shield him. Yet not every uprising ends in flames. In some places, lords negotiate, quickly, nervously. They lower taxes, grant limited freedoms, forgive old debts. Anything to make the crowd go away. And when the revolts do fail us, they often do it's not because the peasants are wrong, It's because the knights still have swords. For now. But a seed is planted. That old medieval certainty that everyone has a place, and God put you there, is starting to rot. When the people at the bottom realize they can fight back, even lose, and still change the system a little, that's when the real shift begins. You overhear two young farmhands arguing in the barn. One thinks they should move to the city, work as a weaver. The other wants to join a monastery and study. Neither option involves staying tied to the land. Their great-grandparents worked until their fingers bled. The feudal chain that bound labor to land is rusting. Here's something. The lords didn't count on collective memory. After the plagues, people remember who ran, who helped, and who demanded grain taxes while they buried their children. Trust doesn't bounce back easily, and while the nobility tries to reinforce the old ways with fancy words and harsher rules, the world outside keeps changing. Coinage replaces in-kind payment. Peasants learn to read contracts. A tenant farmer today might be a landowner's headache tomorrow. Even the simple act of fleeing to a town can, in some cases, make you legally free after a year and a day. It's like watching the roots of a tree uncoiled beneath the soil. You don't see the full collapse yet, but you know something massive is loosening. As the rebels disband for the night, you hear a father tell his son, "We might not win today, but they hurt us." You lie back on the cold earth. The stars are still there, unchanged. But the ground beneath them, it's beginning to tremble. The cathedral looms above you like a mountain of stone and stained glass. Its spire trying to pierce the sky, as if begging heaven for attention. Inside, the incense is thick. The Latin chants echo from walls built a century ago, and somewhere, in the gloom, a gold-encrusted bishop adjusts his rings. On the surface, the church still appears to reign supreme. But look closer, that priest over there. He's muttering his sermon a little too quickly. Half his parish doesn't show up anymore. The tithes are late. The parishioners are restless. You hear it in the way they shift on their pews, in the way they hesitate before crossing themselves. Something feels ... off. The church, the spiritual backbone of the medieval world, is starting to wobble. It begins subtly. A few whispered doubts. A priest who fails to comfort a family after a plague death. A bishop who mysteriously acquires new land, new robes, and a new fondness for private feasts. Then come the public embarrassments. Multiple popes, conflicting doctrines, and a whole lot of finger-pointing in Latin. Historians still argue whether the church's decline started with corruption or confusion, but either way, it's undeniable. In 1309, the papacy packs up and moves to Avignon, France. That's right, the Pope not to Jerusalem, not to Rome, but to a French riverside town. And suddenly, the Pope starts looking a little too cozy with the French crown. Coincidence? People aren't so sure. Then, in 1378, it gets worse. A second pope is elected in Rome. Now, there are two men claiming to be God's representative on earth. And later, a third one joins the fray. Because why settle for a two-headed crisis when you can have three? It's called the Western Schism. And if you think medieval minds were confused before, try choosing which pope's excommunication you're supposed to be afraid of. You stroll through a town square and spot posters for both popes, nailed on opposite walls. The local priest just shrugs when asked which one he supports. "Depends who's visiting this week," he mutters. The confusion doesn't stop there. The selling of indulgences, basically spiritual coupons, to reduce your time in purgatory becomes so widespread, it's hard to tell if the church is saving souls or just funding renovations. In some towns, you can buy an indulgence from a traveling friar next to the fishmonger. One fringe belief circulating at the time, that some monks secretly copied charms and lucky scriptures onto strips of parchment, selling them as holy protections against illness. Probably not in the official manual. But desperate times call for creative piety. The credibility of the church takes a beating not just from scandal, but from silence. During the plague, prayers didn't work. Holy water didn't help. Processions ended in more infection. And people noticed. A mother prays for her child's recovery and he dies anyway. A monk says the illness is a test and then drops dead himself. Faith begins to fracture under the weight of grief. Meanwhile, thinkers are stirring the pot. You hear someone mention John Wycliffe in a market stall in English. Theologian who dares suggest the Bible should be in English, not Latin. Radical right. He even claims that the Pope might not be infallible. You glance over your shoulder. Instinctively, another name floats by. Jan Hus, a Czech priest preaching reform. He's got crowds hanging on his every word. The church eventually burns him at the stake, but his ideas refuse to die. Instead, they smolder beneath the surface. Waiting back in your little parish, things feel different now. Confessions are shorter. Mass is thinner. Even the sermons, once full of certainty, now sound like carefully chosen guesses. One young novice you meet seems genuinely kind. But when you ask why he joined the church, he hesitates. I needed food, he says simply, and they had a roof, not exactly divine calling. Weirdly, the Gothic cathedrals you admire those towering marvels of pointed arches and rows. Windows represent both the peak and the decline. They're beautiful, sure. But they also reveal how much wealth the church had, and still demanded from its flock. You remember the story someone told you. A village taxed for decades to fund a cathedral, while half its children never reached adulthood. Holiness and hardship entwined. And yet the church does still offer comfort. For many, it's the only place that teaches mercy, or writes down names, or buries the poor. But the monopoly is cracking. Universities are teaching philosophy. Merchants are forging new alliances. Lay people are reading religious texts in secret, sometimes in translation. The gap between spiritual authority and personal belief is widening one day. You pass a street performer reciting a parable not from scripture, but from memory, with his own twist. The crowd laughs, thinks, claps. The message lands. No incense, no Latin, just words and wonder. That's the thing. Truth is escaping the pulpit. And once it's loose, it's hard to recage. You light a candle in a side chapel before leaving. Not because you're afraid of hell, necessarily, but because old habits die slowly. Outside, you hear a rooster crow. A monk sweeps the courtyard. In silence, above, gargoyles stare down, not to protect you, but to remind you. Even the holiest walls can crumble. You're walking across a dry field, dotted with trampled grass and broken lances. The smell of sweat and rust still hanging in the morning air. No banners wave, no cheering crowds. Just silence, and maybe a few bored crows picking over yesterday's carnage. This was once a battlefield. A proper one nobleman on horseback, squires running orders, trumpets blaring the glory of medieval chivalry. But looking around now, it's painfully clear. The age of the knight is starting to fall out of fashion. And nobody told the knights. You find a group of them near a grove, polishing their armor while trading complaints. One mutters that there haven't been any real wars in years. Another grumbles about being replaced by commoners with longbows. A third simply sighs, staring into the distance like someone trying to remember why he learned how to joust in the first place. Knighthood, once the pinnacle of honor and status, has started to feel more like an expensive hobby. It wasn't always this way. Back in the 11th and 12th centuries, being a knight was like being a medieval rock star, complete with groupies okay, courtly love, custom outfits, and songs written about your heroic deeds. But now, fewer dragons, more accounting. One mainstream historical truth. By the 14th century, military tactics were changing fast. Mounted knights were no longer invincible. The English longbow, famously wielded at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, could pierce plate armor from a distance. One peasant with a decent aim could ruin a noble's day on his expensive horse. Historians still argue whether the longbow or gunpowder had the greater impact on battlefield evolution. But either way, the knights' dominance was wobbling. Not that they took it well. Tournaments became more elaborate, more theatrical, an echo of real combat, but increasingly detached from actual war. You walk past a wooden arena where two armored nobles are bashing each other with blunted maces for an audience of bored courtiers and overexcited children. A jester juggles apples nearby. The crowd claps politely. This isn't warfare, it's entertainment. There's a quirky account from Burgundy of a knight who insisted on dueling, a cannon literally charging it on horseback. It did not end well, but you almost admire the commitment. The values of chivalry still echo through the great halls. Honor, loyalty, courage, but the world that supported those values, castle walls, feudal bonds, endless little wars between neighbors is dissolving. Even the code of conduct becomes more performative. Knights pledge loyalty to their ladies, while also hiring themselves out as mercenaries. Some start working for foreign kings, others for the highest bidder. An awkward look for a class that once saw itself as morally superior. And then there's the fashion crisis. Plate armor keeps getting heavier, shinier, and more expensive. You pass a young squire dragging 2 bags of greaves and pauldrons, huffing like a mule. His master's armor takes 2 servants and a winch to put on. Meanwhile, the poor are wearing padded gambesons, carrying pikes, and forming tightly packed infantry lines that move like walls of sharp teeth. In Italy, city-states are hiring entire companies of these professional soldiers. In Switzerland, pike formations are basically medieval bulldozers. You sit by a fire with a group of older men who once served as knights. One of them picks at his stew and says quietly, "It used to mean something. Wearing the mail, now it just slows you down." There's a sadness there. Knighthood wasn't just a profession. It was an identity, a whole worldview built on the idea that might and right were the same thing. That the noble class ruled because they were brave, and just, and chosen. But when battles are won by people who never learned how to bow before, a lady or write poetry on a shield, when the old castles are falling 2 cannon blasts in minutes instead of withstanding sieges for months, the illusion starts to crack. Even literature catches on. The Arthurian romances, once tales of glorious quests and noble virtue, start to feel like bedtime stories for grown men clinging to a lost age. You hear a minstrel in a tavern singing about Sir Lancelot, but the crowd laughs in the wrong places. It's not that courage has vanished, it's just that courage now comes in different clothes. You pass a group of city guards, hardened men with crossbows and boiled leather armor. No crests, no horses, but they get the job done. And they don't need to recite any oaths to do it. The knight, as a figure, doesn't disappear overnight. For centuries more, they'll fight, serve, and strut in parade armor. But they're no longer the keystone of power. They're nostalgia wrapped in steel. One day, you watch a nobleman ride into town in full armor. The children cheer. The elders nod politely. But a merchant nearby smirks and mutters that'll rust before it earns him anything. Ouch. You walk on. Past the tournament grounds, past the training fields, past the echo of a code that once defined Europe. There's still beauty in the knight's image, a strange mix of grit and grace, but beauty doesn't win wars anymore. The age of muscle and metal is dimming. You blink against the dust as the road beneath your feet turns from dirt to cobblestone. The scent in the air shifts to less dung, more bread. Horses give way to carts stacked with dyed cloth, dried fish, little wheels of cheese with prices that make you wince. No more village quiet. This is city noise now, hawkers shouting over one another, bells clanging in towers, and footsteps, so many footsteps. Welcome to the city. It doesn't have to be London, Paris, or Florence. It could be Ghent, Lübeck, Venice, or Prague. The names vary, but the pattern doesn't. What once was a tiny market square with a wooden chapel has exploded into a thriving urban tangle, and behind every stone wall and crooked alley, a little more of the medieval world's foundations are being chipped away. You pass a group of workers, building a new stone guild hall. Not a church, not a castle, something different. Civic, practical, horizontal power, not vertical. Cities are rising, and castles, they're starting to look out of place. In the countryside, power still feels personal. Landlords, stewards, manor courts, that one knight who always rides drunk on St. Michael's Day. But in cities, power comes through laws, councils, guilds. You watch a shoemaker argue with a city guard about market stall space, and neither bows. The old hierarchies don't disappear in town, they just evolve. The church still looms, but now it shares the skyline with town halls. Nobles still own property, but merchants now buy it too, sometimes with cash counted out right in front of them. And those castles outside the walls. Sure, they're impressive, but they can't control what's happening inside. Here's a mainstream historical fact. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many cities in Europe were effectively self-governing. They had charters, laws, taxes, militias. Some even printed their own coins. Free cities they were called, and they weren't exaggerating. Inside the city walls, people begin to measure themselves by skill, not bloodline. You meet a blacksmith whose family used to be serfs. Now, he owns his forge, votes in council elections, and has 3 apprentices, one of whom plays the lute badly, but with great passion. Historians still argue whether this urban growth helped destroy feudalism, or just gave it a shinier mask. But either way, it's a shift. The quirky part: cities actually smelled better than many castles, thanks to rudimentary drainage systems and a vested interest in not dying of waste-related illnesses. Town officials begin organizing rudimentary sanitation. It's not glamorous, just a guy with a rake and a bucket, but still, progress. You pass a university tucked into a row of shops, with students arguing outside over theology, love, and who drank the last of the cider. Inside, dusty old books are being cracked open. Aristotle is making a comeback. Ideas are flying faster than the pigeons from the cathedral roof. The intellectual life of the city is noisy, bold, and slightly drunk. It doesn't belong to monasteries anymore. Even the church notices. You catch a bishop peering nervously at a printing press demonstration. The merchant showing it off grins and turns the crank faster, making a dozen pamphlets flutter like leaves in a windstorm. Information, once locked away behind scriptoria and sacred ink, is about to become reproducible. The church sees a miracle. The city sees a market trade, drives everything here. Boats arrive from the east with spices and silks. German merchants bring metals and beer. Italian bankers carry ledgers, contracts, and a suspicious number of rings. And where trade flows, culture follows. You hear music with unfamiliar rhythms, spot fabrics in colors you've never seen in nature. Watch children play games with strange foreign names. The world is shrinking, and cities are its pressure points. One merchant jokes that the new language of Europe isn't Latin, it's bookkeeping. Even the buildings tell the story. That cathedral you visited a few sections ago. It's still standing, but it's getting outpaced by palazzos, clock towers, and glass-fronted shops with hanging signs that spell out what you're buying. Cities don't need protection from castles. They build their own walls, literal ones and legal ones, and behind those walls, a different world is blooming. The daughter of a tanner can become a scribe. A mason's son might study law. A weaver's apprentice might one day open a shop of his own, no noble blood required. It's not a utopia, far from it. Inequality still thrives. Disease still comes in waves. Riots break out. But the momentum is forward. Not divine order. Not tradition, possibility. A city bell rings noon. The market bustles again. A nobleman tries to buy a silk cloak and has to wait while the merchant finishes arguing over the price of onions with another customer. He's not used to waiting, but no one here cares. That's the secret of the cities. They don't need the medieval world anymore. And the medieval world, it's starting to look a little rural. You stand atop a dusty hill under a sun that's far too bright for the mood. Below you, rows of abandoned tents, broken shields, forgotten sandals. Some banners still flap in the wind, but most are face down in the dirt. It's the no one wanted. This was once the frontier of holy war. The Crusades, those long, blood-drenched journeys to the Holy Land, promised redemption, glory, and more than a little loot. They stirred every medieval chord: faith, honor, vengeance, and the irresistible lure of other people's gold. But now, the war cries have faded, and in their place, hangovers. Political ones. It all started in 1095, with Pope Urban II's famous call to arms. He promised that fighting in the East would wipe your sins clean, like a medieval car wash for the soul, but with more swords. Over the next 2 centuries, Thousands answered the call, knights, peasants, mercenaries, and more than a few people, who probably should have stayed home. You pass a stone marker that reads "God wills it," weathered now, chipped, and leaning. A pilgrim once carved it here, maybe on the way to Antioch. He might not have made it past the next dune. Here's a mainstream historical truth. Despite all the bloodshed, only the First Crusade truly succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, and even then, it was a brief, brutal success. Subsequent crusades grew messier, more political, and increasingly awkward. The Fourth Crusade. They never even made it to the Holy Land. They sacked Constantinople instead, a Christian city. Oops. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were mostly about faith, greed, politics, or a collective case of, "We're bored, let's conquer something." The answer is probably yes to all of the above. And now, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the glory has tarnished. The Crusader states have collapsed. The Muslim powers in the Middle East, led by figures like Saladin centuries earlier, proved just as strategic, just as resourceful, and far more united by the end. Back in Europe, you hear whispers in the city markets. Didn't your uncle die for nothing? Did the church even know what it was doing? Jerusalem? I thought we needed grain. The old rallying cry of Deus Vult has become background noise. Still, the scars remain. You visit a chapel in the countryside where a dusty relic is kept behind cracked glass, said to be a thorn from the true cross. The locals still kneel, still believe, but even the priest's voice wavers as he recites the tale. And here comes the quirky part. During the later Crusades, some nobles began treating the journey like a long, violent holiday. There are accounts of knights packing musical instruments, elaborate wardrobes, even wine cellars, yes, on crusade. Somewhere between slaughter and sightseeing, the spirit of things got a little confused. Back home, those who returned brought more than just souvenirs. They brought silk, spices, stories. Doubt the East wasn't a wasteland of heretics. It had cities, scholars, art, ideas. People began to realize Europe wasn't the only center of the universe. You wander through a university courtyard and overhear a student discussing Arabic numerals. Yes, those same digits you use to count your coins, imported through contact with the Islamic world. Suddenly, the West is borrowing from the East. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, all filtering into Europe. Piece by precious piece. A merchant tells you he made more money importing Damascene steel than his father ever earned in a lifetime of tithes. Another proudly displays Persian rugs next to Flemish cloth. The crossbow, once condemned by the church as too ungodly, is now manufactured in bulk thanks to knowledge traded from beyond Christendom. The holy wars didn't just drain treasure. They opened channels, and yet, the cultural confusion is real. One traveling knight insists on fasting on Fridays, carrying a relic in one hand and a jar of imported dates in the other. When asked if he believes in the war anymore, he shrugs. The markets are better than the miracles. The church tries to revive crusading zeal with fresh campaigns in Eastern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula, branding them with the same holy language. But it's not the same. The romance is gone. You can't keep telling the same story once the ending's been spoiled. One bishop makes a fiery speech in the city square, urging a new holy mission. He's met with polite applause and quiet yawns. The tavern next door is louder. Even the knights remember them, seem half. They ride out in their polished mail, but their hearts stay behind with their debts, their bored wives, and their unpaid footmen. You stop at a roadside shrine, once built to bless crusaders as they passed. It's crumbling now, covered in moss. A child lights a candle, they're not out of reverence, but because she likes the flickering. That's what the Crusades have become. Flickers not forgotten, exactly, just dulled. The ideals have been ground down by time, like a blade used too often on the wrong kind of enemy. You walk on, past the fallen banner, the empty field, the forgotten songs of war. The Holy Land is far away, now not just in miles, but in meaning. Europe is turning its gaze inward, toward its cities, its thinkers, its changing power. The road that once led to Jerusalem now leads somewhere else, entirely. You sit by a riverbank, the water calm and glassy as it snakes past rows of trees and fading cottages. But above the hush of flowing water, you hear it click, scratch, shuffle, clang. The sound of metal plates sliding, coins being counted, ledgers flipped open. No chanting monks or galloping knights, here just the crisp, undeniable rhythm of commerce. Money is talking now, and the old world, it's listening. Medieval Europe had always run on a kind of economic autopilot. Land was wealth, crops were currency, and power came from the right to tax both. But slowly, like ink bleeding through parchment, that model is changing. Welcome to the rise of a cash economy. You pass a blacksmith hammering out nails not for a manor, but for a merchant's warehouse. The smith doesn't get paid in chickens or sheaves of barley anymore. He gets coin. He can spend that coin, in town, on goods. From a man who's never even seen a plow, here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, minted currency was circulating in volumes unheard of 2 centuries earlier. Trade routes had matured. Cities needed exchangeable value, and taxes. Well, kings were quickly discovering that demanding coin was cleaner and far easier to skim than trying to round up pigs and onions. You find yourself standing in a medieval counting house, one of those early banks with iron bars, stern clerks, and the smell of too many ledgers left open overnight. A merchant slides a sack of florins across the counter, buying silk futures from a man he's never met. And while historians still argue whether capitalism truly began in the late Middle Ages, or was just slowly forming in the shadows, no one doubts this. The idea that money can breed money is gaining traction. This makes people nervous, especially the old aristocracy. A nobleman paces the edge of a city square, watching as guilds set prices, merchants fund cathedrals, and bankers lend to kings. He mutters under his breath. They've never even held a sword, but deep down, he knows the truth coin outlasts bloodlines. The quirky part. Some nobles start marrying merchants' daughters just to get access to dowries and loans. Love, honor, and 12% annual interest. You stroll through a trade, fair and explosion, of goods, smells, and languages. Flemish wool, Bohemian silver, Venetian glass, North African spices. Deals are struck with handshakes and sealed with wax. One trader jokes that he's more fluent in pricing than prayer. Even small towns have begun minting their own coinage. You notice how peasants pay their rents, not with grain, but with coin, and in doing so, gain leverage. When the harvest fails, they don't owe as much. When prices fluctuate, they negotiate. Cash is slippery, but powerful. The shift bleeds into every layer of society. Guilds gain political clout in cities. Wage laborers travel where pay is better. Urban poor demand cash instead of corvée labor. Lords who once lived off their land now find themselves selling tracts of it just to pay debts owed to a fur trader. You stop in a tavern where an accountant drinks quietly, muttering to himself about double-entry bookkeeping, an invention imported from Italy, one that makes it much harder for anyone to lie about their debts. He says it with reverence, as if it were scripture. In many ways, this is the end of land as the ultimate wealth. Now, it's liquidity, movement, abstraction. A grain field is good, yes. But a portfolio of loans across 4 cities, that's the new power. And the church, it's not immune. The PayPal states are knee-deep in financial politics, collecting tithes through agents and often paying armies in coin. The very institution that once condemned usury charging interest now wiggles around the edges of it. You watch a bishop give a sermon on humility, then ride away in a gilded carriage bought with a merchant's donation. Even commoners are catching on. A mason tells you he refuses to be paid in feast day promises anymore. It's coin or nothing. He's saving up to buy a house. Imagine that, a former serf saving to own property. And here's the sneaky twist. This monetization subtly undermines feudal bonds. If you can pay your rent with silver, you don't have 2 days of forced labor. If you can hire a plowman, you don't need your lord's oxen. Bit by bit, coin chips away at obligation. You pass a young woman running a stall selling dyed wool caps. Her mother was a bonded tenant. She's an entrepreneur. No crest, no title, but she sets her prices, manages her stall, and handles customers better than most squires handle swords. The road ahead is lined with trade posts, and those strange little booths where men scribble on parchment and calculate profit margins in 4 different currencies. You blink, and for a moment, it feels almost modern. But the coins clink heavy in your pouch. They carry more than just value. They carry momentum, a world in motion. The age of knights and oaths is fading. The age of markets has arrived. You duck into a narrow alley just as the sky opens up, rain hissing onto cobblestones like 1,000 tiny arrows. The smell of the city sharpens whetstone, horse dung, roasting meat from a nearby stall. You find cover under an overhanging eave, watching as a small group of people gather outside a wooden building with leaded glass windows and a carved emblem above the door. It's a guild hall, and inside, power, not the sword-swinging, armor-rattling kind. The quiet, organized kind that rewrites economies and reshapes communities. Guilds, once simple trade collectives, have become engines of urban life. Tanners, weavers, blacksmiths, masons, coopers, bakers. Each craft has its own little kingdom, complete with rules, rituals, and an occasionally absurd obsession with who gets to wear what kind of hat. You slip inside, unnoticed, and watch as the guildmasters bicker gently over bread prices and apprenticeship terms. One complains about bootleggers setting up shop outside the town walls. Another demands stricter inspections for wool quality. They sip warm ale from pewter cups as they debate the fate of an entire industry. Guilds began as a way to protect workers and uphold standards. But by the late Middle Ages, they're more than just trade unions. They control who enters a profession, who earns how much, and what's considered legal work in the first place. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many cities, guilds held civic power. They could vote in municipal elections, fund city defenses, and influence laws. That affected everyone, not just their members. Some cities were practically run by guilds, a proto-democracy of aprons and calloused hands, and yet, historians still argue whether guilds were engines of progress or clever ways for elites to dress up old hierarchies in new leather aprons. Did they protect workers, or just form exclusive clubs that guarded wealth and expertise? The answer, as usual, is somewhere murky and medieval. You pass a chalkboard outside a bakery guild, a list of authorized prices for bread, butter, and rye loaves. Next to it, a warning. Anyone found baking without guild permission will be fined and, maybe shamed in the square. There are rules here. And woe to the rebel who dares invent a new kind of croissant. One fringe detail, in some German cities, guilds held elaborate guild plays in the streets, mini-dramas, celebrating their craft. The carpenters would act out scenes from Noah's Ark because of all the wood, obviously, while the butchers dramatized biblical sacrifice. It was pageantry, civic pride, and branding all rolled into one. But don't mistake it all for happy artisanal vibes. Beneath the surface, competition is brewing. In the outer districts, you find weavers working late into the night, their looms clacking like skeletal fingers. They're not guild members. They can't afford the fees. They work fast, they work quiet, and they sell their cloth at suspiciously low prices. The guild calls them illegals. Everyone else calls them affordable. And there it is, the system fraying again. As money flows faster, demand for goods increases. Guild regulations, once helpful, start to feel like chains. Innovation slows, newcomers are shut out. And enterprising citizens, too poor, too young, or too impatient to wait, begin creating a black market shadow economy just outside the guilds. Reach, you hear of a woman who brews ale in her basement. It's stronger than the guild-approved stuff, and sells twice as fast. She's fined, warned, and eventually ignored. The people want her ale, not the watered-down, price-fixed version. One merchant jokes that he runs to books, one for the guild, and one for actual sales. Everyone laughs, a bit too knowingly. The rise of guilds, once a triumph of order and fairness, now risks becoming a victim of its own success. And then there's the next threat, technology. You see it in a new kind of loom, faster, simpler, usable by just one person. The guild calls it dangerous, a threat to craftsmanship. But a few brave souls are already using it in secret, producing fabric in hours instead of days. It's not quite a revolution, not yet, but it's close enough to make the guildmaster sweat. Outside, the rain slows. You step back into the street and notice how uneven the cobblestones are, some freshly laid, some ancient and cracked. The perfect metaphor. In cities, on farms, and in the hands of innovators, cracks are forming in the medieval model. The guild, once a symbol of civic dignity, is becoming a symbol of friction. The apprentice who once dreamed of mastering a trade now dreams of bypassing the system entirely, starting something new, and you keep walking. Past workshops and chalk signs and faded coats of arms etched above doorways. You turn a corner and hear the click of another loom, the whisper of a deal made in secret, and the laughter of someone selling what they're not allowed to sell. The rules are still there, but they're being bent, and soon they'll be broken. You wake up in the middle of the night to the eerie sound of silence, not a peaceful silence, but a tense, held breath kind of hush that blankets the entire village. Something's wrong. The hearths are cold. The dogs aren't barking. Even the birds seem to be missing. You step outside and follow the faint flicker of torchlight to the town square. They're hunched around a fire. A group of wide-eyed villagers are whispering about omens, bloody moons, sickly cows, a stranger seen walking the fields in rags, muttering scripture backward. No one says it out loud yet, but you know what's coming. Which panic. In a world that has long relied on ritual, faith, and superstition to make sense of suffering, moments of uncertainty invite darker explanations. And as the medieval world begins to crack at its seams plagues, war, hunger, economic instability, people go looking for someone to blame, and they start with witches. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The late Middle Ages saw a growing belief in organized heretical witchcrafts, spurred by both church teachings and popular fear. Though isolated accusations existed earlier, it's now, in the 14th and especially 15th centuries, that things begin to take a grim and coordinated turn. Historians still argue whether this was fueled more by religious doctrine or raw social anxiety. Did theology drive the fear, or was theology just an excuse people clung to when their world stopped making sense? You wander into a church where the priest is delivering a fire and brimstone sermon against servants of the devil. His voice rises with each curse. Famine, pestilence, blighted crops, infertility, all blamed on unseen hands. He slams a book shut. The crowd murmurs in agreement. You glance sideways at the old widow who lives near the woods, the one who brews odd-smelling teas and always seems to know when storms are coming. She's standing very still. One quirky tidbit. In some regions, toads were believed to be witches, familiar spirit animals, or demons in amphibian disguise. If you owned too many toads, or just had an unlucky number of warts, congratulations. You're suspicious now. The shift from folk belief to organized persecution is subtle, but chilling. The church begins commissioning manuals, most infamously the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, around 1486, a priest's how-to guide on identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It becomes disturbingly popular, like a grim bestseller. You pass a magistrate's court where an accused woman sits on a stool, being questioned about the death of a neighbor's cow. She denies everything, but her fate may depend on the direction the wind is blowing or whether her cat meowed at the wrong time. Even the methods become formalized. Trial by ordeal, dunking, sleep deprivation, forced confessions. It's a grim theater, and the audience is always ready to believe the worst. And it's not just women. Though they make up the majority of the accused, men, children, even clergy sometimes find themselves dragged into the hysteria. One young man, a traveling herbalist, is imprisoned for selling potions that might help fertility. The fact that they also might cause indigestion is seen as proof of devilry. You sit beside a frightened girl who says her grandmother told her how to stop nosebleeds with a charm. Now she's terrified someone will overhear. Fear spreads faster than truth, and the irony. All of this is happening during a time of massive intellectual awakening. Universities are thriving. Trade is booming. Cities are modernizing. But fear doesn't respect progress. It clings to the cracks. You visit a scribe who's just finished copying an official list of symptoms of witchcraft. He rolls his eyes but shrugs. They pay me either way. The social tension is palpable. As class systems shift and traditional power structures crumble, there's an instinct to cling harder to anything that still feels certain. And fear, sadly, is one of the most reliable tools of control. It's easier to blame the midwife than admit childbirth is risky. Easier to condemn the cunning man than accept that illness has no clear cause. One merchant tells you in hushed tones that he lost his entire winter shipment, not to rot or bandits, but to a neighbor's evil eye. He won't say her name, but he's already reported her. And the worst part, the accusations stick. Truth, logic, and evidence become irrelevant in the face of community panic. Once suspicion attaches to someone, it spreads like wildfire. Whole villages get swept up. Old debts are repaid with a whispered rumor. Jealousies curdle into formal complaints. You pass a burned-out cottage. No one speaks of who lived there. The fire crackles in the town square. The villagers exchange worried glances, each wondering if they'll be next. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because, in this moment of history, that hardly matters. The medieval world, so long built on order, hierarchy, and holy certainty, is now haunted by its own shadows. And for some, it's safer to burn the darkness than question it. The moon is full tonight, but its light hits different, more silver than gold, more cold than calming. You're on a bridge that crosses a slow, winding river. One side of the river holds a quiet village, still clinging to the old rhythms. The chapel bell rings at sunrise. The Lord Steward counts chickens, and no one speaks ill of the king. On the other side, chaos. Not fire and pitchforks, more like contracts, ledgers, petitions, protests, a very medieval kind of chaos. Because across the water, the people are no longer content with being quiet subjects. They want answers. They want rights. They want to know why everything's broken, and why the people who broke it are still in charge. You're watching the birth of political unrest. Here's a mainstream historical truth. The late Middle Ages saw a wave of peasant revolts, urban uprisings, and organized resistance against both feudal lords and royal authority. Most weren't revolutions in the modern sense, but they were warning signs. You pass a group of farmers gathering near a crossroads. They've scrawled messages onto bits of bark and nailed them to trees. Fair rents or empty fields, one says. Another simply reads, "We are watching." In 1381, this kind of discontent exploded into the Peasants' Revolt in England. Angry over taxes, labor laws, and broken promises after the Black Death, thousands of workers marched on London. They demanded better wages, lower rents, and the end of serfdom. They stormed castles. They executed officials. They even cornered the king. Historians still argue whether this revolt was a doomed tantrum or the first gasp of a new social order. But one thing's clear: it shook the establishment. The king promised reforms. Then, when the mob left, he revoked them. But the damage was done. Serfs had seen the palace walls. They knew now that power could be frightened. You walk through a city square where artisans are handing out pamphlets, not religious ones, political ones. Some call for wage protections. Others demand representation on town councils. A few are just poems that absolutely roast the local magistrate. One of them rhymes plague rat with tax hat. It's surprisingly catchy. This isn't just grumbling, it's coordinated. In Flanders, textile workers organize massive strikes. In Florence, the Ciompi revolt erupts, led by wool carders, demanding a voice in government. In the German lands, towns begin forming leagues, negotiating with kings, and sometimes fighting their own wars. Even among the nobility, rebellion stirs. You hear of barons forming coalitions to restrain royal excess. Some are tired of losing land to taxation. Others are just grumpy that the king won't listen. Either way, alliances form in candlelit halls over goblets of wine and whispered oaths. And here's your quirky tidbit. One of the most dramatic French uprisings, the Jacquerie, was partly inspired by peasant frustration over knights losing battles. That's right, commoners were angry that their defenders were getting humiliated on the battlefield and still demanding rent. You watch as a tax collector approaches a small farmstead. The old man inside tells him politely but firmly to shove off. That would have gotten him hanged a generation ago. Now, the tax collector hesitates. He's seen what angry villagers can do. The unrest isn't always violent. Sometimes it's just withdrawal. Peasants vanish from estates, taking their labor with them. Whole fields go untilled. Lords complain, but their letters are full of helplessness. The tenants have fled, and we cannot find them. You sit beside a stonemason eating his lunch. He tells you that his father was a villain legally bound to a lord, but he charges for his labor, negotiates his rates, and owns the roof over his head. I'm not free, he says, but I'm not chained either. And yet, the old guard pushes back. You hear of harsh new laws, wage caps, movement restrictions, crackdowns on gatherings. In some places, just complaining about your lord could land you in stocks. Or worse, but even fear doesn't work the way it used to. One night, you witness a midnight meeting in a forest, clearing candles flickering, voices low, farmers, craftsmen, even a young monk. They pass around a parchment with bold inked lines, demands for fair justice, shared grazing rights, and a say in choosing local officials. It's not rebellion, not exactly, it's self-respect. The medieval world was built on fixed hierarchies: king over lord, lord over vassal, priest over layman, man over woman, soul over body. But now those lines are being questioned. Bent, the people haven't overthrown the system, but they're learning how to talk back. One town you visit has expelled its lord entirely. A council runs the show, now mostly merchants and guild reps. They've renamed the main road Liberty Lane. The old manor turned into a hospital. The guards still wear swords, but they answer to the town, not the crown. You ask the council scribe if this will last. He shrugs. Nothing lasts, but it's ours for now. You cross the bridge again, back into the quiet side of the river. The chapel still rings its bell. The steward still counts his chickens. But the world is changing whether they hear it or not. You're walking through the ruins of a monastery, its once grand cloisters, now half swallowed by ivy. The stone arches fractured like tired bones. You pause under the remnants of what was probably a scriptorium. Pigeons roost where monks once copied sacred texts in silence. The only sound now, the wind whistling through an empty bell tower. Not long ago, places like this were the beating heart of Europe's soul. The church wasn't just religion. It was power, law, land, and learning, all rolled into one vast, incense-scented institution. And while it's still here, you can feel it. Something is slipping, not collapse. More like erosion. Here's a mainstream historical fact. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the church's influence over European life, while still immense, had begun to decline. Not because of one dramatic event, but from a slow buildup of scandals, crises, and a growing chorus of internal dissent. You stop by a roadside shrine. Someone's left a bouquet of wildflowers and a tiny coin, sweet, but scratched into the wood. Beneath the icon is a note. The bishop owns 4 mills. Pray for your taxes. Oh, oaf, once upon a time, people feared God's wrath. Now, more and more of them are just annoyed at his accountants. Let's rewind a little. The 14th century brought the Avignon papacy, where the Pope moved from Rome to France, and stayed there for nearly 70 years. Critics joked that the papacy was being run by the French king. Then came the Great Schism, not the East-West one, the other one where 2. And at one point even 3 rival popes all claimed to be the real deal. Historians still argue whether the schism did more to damage the church's authority or simply reveal the politics that had always been there. Either way, it was a theological train wreck, and the faithful noticed. You walk through a town where people still attend Mass, but fewer of them kneel. They mutter, they side-eye. The priest's new velvet shoes. One merchant smirks, we tithe for his wine. God drinks water. Then, there's the growing tide of heresy movements that question not just corruption, but core teachings. In Bohemia, followers of Jan Hus preach that the church should be poor, the scriptures in the common tongue, and salvation not something you can buy. You overhear someone at an inn whisper, "I think Hus had a point." Then they immediately look over their shoulder. The quirky part. In some places, locals begin organizing their own prayer groups, completely outside clerical control. In the Low Countries, the Brethren of the Common Life pop up semi-monastic communities, focused on education and quiet devotion. No wealth, no hierarchy, no incense. Just people trying to live good lives without bribing saints or bishops. And education plays a big role. You pass a printing shop where a young man is typesetting a tract in German, titled, "Why You Should Question the Pulpit." He says he plans to print 400 copies by next week. 400. A monk with a quill would need half a lifetime for that. The printing press is like a matchbox in a dry forest. Once people can read, they start asking questions, and not everyone likes the answers. You pause at a university courtyard, where theology students argue over the meaning of grace, transubstantiation, and whether the Pope's authority is divine or just deeply convenient. Meanwhile in Rome, a cardinal orders a new marble statue. The cost, enough to feed a small town for a year. And then there's the money. Always the money. Indulgences payments to reduce your time in purgatory have become big business. One preacher calls them heaven's fast pass, and people do buy them, because they're scared, because they're hopeful, because they're told they have to. But others start pushing back. If the Pope can free souls from purgatory, one scribe wonders aloud, why doesn't he do it for free? A fair question. You meet a traveling priest who wears rough homespun and preaches barefoot. He says the church has lost its weight, too much gold. Not enough God. His sermons draw small crowds in marketplaces, and his words spread faster than anyone expects. Not a revolution. Not yet, but something's stirring. Even inside the church, reformers are speaking up. Some bishops begin calling for purges of luxury and a return to simplicity. Monasteries, split, some cling to old wealth, others embrace new humility. The divide is growing, and outside, regular people are starting to feel the tremor. You walk through a village during Easter Mass. The pews are half full. The hymns are half sung. People still believe, but they also wonder. One young woman says, quietly, "I love Christ. I'm not sure I love the church." It's a dangerous thought, but not uncommon. Faith is not disappearing. If anything, it's evolving. But the authority that once wrapped itself around every detail of life, from what you wore to whom you married, is unraveling. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. You leave the monastery ruins and walk on. Behind you, moss grows over the stones. Ahead, a street preacher, shouting in the rain. The sacred and the secular are drifting apart, and something new is rising in the space between. You're walking beside a cart full of books, real books. Not scrolls or hand-copied psalters, but printed ones. Neat rows of crisp pages bound in leather and smelling faintly of oil and ink. The man pushing the cart whistles a tune as he navigates the cobbled streets, humming like he's delivering pastries, not powder kegs, because, in a way, that's exactly what he's doing. The printed word is the medieval world's quiet undoing. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Around 1440, Johann Gutenberg introduced the movable type printing press to Europe. By the turn of the 16th century, printing had spread like wildfire. Books that once took months or even years to copy by hand could now be mass-produced in days. The results, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and often unread by those in charge. Until it was far too late. You duck into a print shop and watch the clatter and rhythm of the press in action. A burly apprentice slaps down paper. A skinny one inks the type, and the master printer checks for smudges like a man inspecting holy relics. They're printing a collection of sermons, but not church-approved ones. These are grassroots, bootlegged, a little spicy. You flip through a page. The language is raw, the tone accusatory, and the margin notes. Hilarious. One just reads, "Tell that to the Pope, lol." Okay, not lol, but the spirit's the same. It's not just theology getting the Gutenberg treatment. You see fables, travelogues, herbal guides, political screeds, dirty jokes, weather predictions, poems about chickens, and a handy chart explaining how to calculate your wife's astrological mood swings. Essential content people are reading like never before. And not just the monks and the lords. Artisans, merchants, even curious farmers get their hands on these little rectangles of revolution. A blacksmith wipes soot off his hands to turn the page. A weaver reads aloud to his daughters at dinner. One quirky tidbit: in the early days of printing, some books were deliberately decorated by hand after printing so they still looked like expensive manuscripts. Readers wanted progress, but not too much progress. The authorities are catching on. You pass a bishop's clerk, issuing a list of banned books, his expression somewhere between panic and paper cut. The list gets longer every week. People are reading without permission, he says. It's chaos. He's not wrong. Historians still argue whether the printing press caused the Reformation or just turbocharged it, but either way, the fuse has been lit. Ideas move faster than armies now. Faster than royal messengers. Faster than sermons. And once an idea is out, you can't unprint it. A priest in Cologne preaches against heresy. Half his parishioners are already passing around tracts he hasn't read yet. A university in Paris bans certain books, so students smuggle them in baked inside loaves of bread. You wander into a tavern where someone is reading aloud from a satire poking fun at bishops, who charge for miracles. The crowd laughs, nervously. Some clap. One man mutters, "He's not wrong, but he's going to get arrested." The press doesn't just transmit ideas, it democratizes them. Before, the power to shape thought lay in monasteries, palaces, and cathedrals. Now, it rests on ink-stained fingers. Even language is changing. Books start appearing in German, Dutch not, just Latin. Suddenly, you don't need a university degree to access knowledge. You just need a few coins and decent eyesight, and the elite. They're nervous. One duke commissions his own scribe to copy important texts by hand, refusing to use the common press. His neighbors call him quaint. His banker calls him broke. You walk through a market square, where a printer sets up a table to sell his wares. A friar shouts at him. The printer calmly replies, "I printed your sermon last week. You're welcome." The friar turns red. The crowd chuckles. It's not quite revolution, but it's the beginning of one. The written word isn't just informing people. It's connecting them, uniting them, giving them a shared vocabulary of protest, prayer, satire, and speculation. And it's not just grown-ups getting in on it. You watch a schoolboy recite verses from a printed primer, while his sister giggles and corrects his mistakes. These kids will grow up with more words in their heads than their parents could dream of. Even artists are adapting. You see woodcuts early, printed images being pasted to walls. Some are saints, others are caricatures of greedy monks or foolish nobles. One shows death playing chess with a king. It's captioned, "He always wins." Dark. Sure, but also catchy. The press has made it possible for people to see themselves, their world, and their doubts reflected in print. No more waiting for some traveling preacher to explain the mysteries of life. No more taking the Lord's word as final. Now you can read for yourself. Question for yourself. Believe or not for yourself. The old world relied on control of knowledge. This new world, it thrives on access. As you leave the print shop, the apprentice hands you a pamphlet titled "On the Freedom of the Mind." He winks. First copies. Free. And as you walk away, that pamphlet flutters in your hand like a strange little bird, delicate and entirely alive. You follow a winding road out of the town and into the hills, expecting quiet, maybe the occasional sheep bleating in the distance, or the rustle of wind through oak leaves. But instead, you're met with hammering, the ringing metallic clang, clang, clang of something new being forged, literally. At first, you think it's a smithy. Then you crest the hill. Below, in the valley, sits a vast complex of wooden sheds, water wheels, and smoking chimneys. Streams have been redirected, trees cleared. Iron carts roll along hastily built tracks. It's not a town, not a village. It's something else. You've stumbled upon the early bones of industrialization now. Don't get ahead of yourself, no steam engines yet, no smog-choked cities or time clocks. But the groundwork, it's already being laid here, in the dying years of the medieval world. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the late 15th century, regions like Saxony, northern Italy, and parts of England saw a sharp increase in mining, metallurgy, and textile production, driven not by noble ambition or church decree, but by raw economic demand and emerging technology. You approach a building where workers are pulping rags to make paper. A water wheel powers the entire operation. The foreman, missing 3 teeth, and very proud of it, says they'll sell their next shipment to a printer in Nuremberg. Paper printing profits. These words weren't part of the old, feudal vocabulary. You wander into a copper mine entrance lit by pitch torches. The walls are slick. The air smells of sweat, sulfur, and determination. Miners joke in 5 different dialects, using hand signals more than words. And deep in the tunnels, men extract or not because the king demands it, but because a merchant syndicate has contracted it for coin. That's the difference. Back on the surface, wagons loaded with raw materials roll past, bound for workshops that will turn them into wire, pipe, tools items with names that don't even exist in the peasant lexicon yet. One fringe fact. In certain German towns, metallurgy was so advanced by the 1500s that blast furnaces were producing cast iron decades before most of Europe even realized what that was. You sit with a group of metalworkers on break, eating hard cheese and stale bread. One laughs that his job is more dangerous than jousting. Another brags about earning enough to rent a proper bed in town. They're workers, yes, but they're not bound. They move for wages. That's revolutionary. Historians still argue whether these industries really marked the end of the medieval era, or whether they're just ambitious outliers. But what's clear is this. Something is breaking loose. You pass a field where flax was once grown. Now it's empty. The landowner sold the rights to an investor who built a dye works down by the river. The peasants who once worked this soil now spin yarn on footlooms in rented sheds. There's a quiet shift in rhythm, less seasonal, more mechanical, less holy calendar, more production schedule. The guilds, remember them? They're struggling to keep up. That secret new loom we heard about, it's out in the open now, and spreading. One weaver shows you how it works. Faster, simpler, ruthless. He shrugs. Either you use it, or starve. In Florence, bankers finance silk factories. In Antwerp, investors pool money into joint ventures, early versions of stockholding. And over in the docks, shipwrights are building carvel-hold ships big enough to cross oceans. You walk through a port city where the clamor never stops. Sailors unload barrels, buyers shout prices, foreign merchants haggle in Portuguese, Arabic, and a dozen other tongues. In the chaos, a 10-year-old boy is selling pocket mirrors made from polished tin. He says his uncle forges them using what tools, and they ship to France. The medieval world was based on obligation, stability, inheritance. This world, it's based on movement. You pass a mapmaker, etching new coastlines onto vellum. He's using notes from sailors who ventured further west than anyone before. He doesn't work for a king. He works for an investment firm. Even time feels different. You visit a tower where an early mechanical clock ticks away, not with bells for prayer, but with hours. Regulated, quantified, dividing labor and life into neat slices. The village priest complains that people show up to mass late now. They follow the clock more than the cross. He mutters. You pass an alchemist and engineer, testing a strange wind-powered contraption that grinds grain automatically. His friend, a bookseller, takes notes. We're calling it applied science, he says. Sounds better than sorcery. You laugh. But you also realize you're not in the medieval world anymore. Not fully. Not yet, but almost. The forests are thinning. The rivers are tamed. The human hand now shapes nature faster than the heavens do. A craftsman once built to serve the church. Now he builds to meet demand. A peasant once obeyed, out of tradition. Now he questions him, sometimes refuses. And you You walk between the gears. You see them turning. What was once sacred is becoming efficient, and while knights still joust, kings still wear crowns, and bishops still chant mass behind it all, a very different future is beginning to hum. It's the end of a long road now. Not just the one you've been walking, but the road of a whole civilization, the slow, winding path of the medieval world, stretching from shadowy forests and fortress walls, all the way to bustling ports and candlelit print shops. And as the final twilight settles over this era, it doesn't vanish with a bang or a blaze, but more like a sigh. You find yourself on a hill overlooking a city at dusk. Its skyline is a strange blend. Cathedral spires, next to factory chimneys, castle turrets beside merchant mansions, monasteries half converted into libraries. The world doesn't feel destroyed. It feels rewritten. Down below, bells toll not for vespers, but for curfew, not a commandment from God, but a policy from City Hall. This is how it ends, not with collapse, but with transformation. Here's your final mainstream fact. Historians typically mark the close of the medieval era, somewhere around the late 15th century, give or take a few decades. By then, the cumulative weight of the Black Death, military revolutions, urbanization, religious doubt, economic shifts, and intellectual awakening had reshaped life so thoroughly that it no longer resembled what had come before. You stroll through the winding alleys of this transitional city. A street performer plays a lute near a tavern where someone's reading from a printed sonnet. A fishmonger haggles in front of a shop that sells spices from lands once considered mythical. Above, an astronomer peers through a polished lens, charting stars with instruments older thinkers would have called blasphemous. He doesn't pray before he observes. He calculates. Historians still argue whether this change was a fall or simply a rebranding. Did the medieval world collapse under its own contradictions, or did it shed its skin like a snake, slithering into something sleeker, sharper, and utterly new? You stop by a schoolhouse, where children copy Latin phrases into little booklets. Their teacher, a former monk, teaches arithmetic and astronomy, alongside theology. One of the boys wants to be a banker. Another, a ship captain. One girl says she wants to be someone who writes things that other people read. You smile. She will. Even art is shifting. You spot a fresco, half covered by scaffolding. It's being repainted, still religious, but now the figures have shadows, muscles, perspective. The saints look startlingly human. In a nearby parlor, two gentlemen discuss maps over goblets of wine. Not old pilgrimage maps with Jerusalem at the center. These are scaled, measured, gridded, and there's something interesting in the corner of one. A sketched coastline labeled Terra Nova. A new land, a new world. One quirky tidbit to end on. In 1493, a German printer named Hartmann Schedel published the Nuremberg Chronicle, a lavishly illustrated history of the world. It began with the biblical flood, moved through Babylon and Rome, and ended with his own time. People now knew they were living at the end of something and the beginning of something else. You pass a knight in battered armor, arguing with a merchant in silk. Their fight isn't about honor or bloodlines. It's about shipping rights. You step into a church. It's still beautiful, still echoing with candlelight. But the congregation is thinner. The priest's voice quieter. Outside, someone sells indulgences. Inside, someone doubts them, and the people they look forward now, not just upward. One peasant, leaning on his hoe, asks about America. Another wonders if a new prophet might rise in Wittenberg. You overhear a student say, "Soon we'll read the Bible in our own language." And somewhere, in a dimly lit study, a man writes in bold Latin, "Man is the measure of all things." The world you've walked through of manners and monks, relics and rituals, knights and plagues, is still here, technically, but it's not the same. The walls are cracking. The roads are repaving. The questions are louder, and the future, it's already pounding at the door. You linger for a moment longer on that hill, watching as the stars begin to appear, one by one, above this strange liminal city. It's not just an ending, it's a hinge, a turning point, a whisper that the story, in all its chaotic human complexity, is far from over. So now, with the echoes of footsteps fading into the soft dark, and the old bells silenced behind thick stone walls, it's time to let go of this world. The clamor, the questions, the crooked alleys, and candlelit prayers there, fading gently now, like ink on old parchment. Let your breath slow, your shoulders drop. The noise is behind you. The future hasn't quite begun. You're floating, gently, between two great ages, no longer tied to feudal oaths or midnight bells. Not yet pulled into the storm of revolutions to come. Just drift here, in this in-between. Imagine the stars overhead, new constellations, uncharted, unfamiliar, but somehow reassuring. Imagine a quiet stream winding past a broken water wheel. Imagine ivy overtaking a forgotten chapel, wrapping stone in green softness. The world is always changing, always becoming. And tonight, as your eyes begin to close, maybe you feel a little more connected to those long-ago lives, scratching out a living in the mud, building cathedrals to reach the heavens, carving truth into paper, one careful letter at a time. Let your breath become the rhythm of a printing press. Let your thoughts tumble like sacks of grain onto an old dock. Let your body soften like candle wax under warm light. You're safe now. The past is done, whispering, sleep well, traveler. You made it through the fall of a world, and you're ready for whatever dreams lie ahead.